Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mad Scientist Brewing Beer Education Series. Today's video, we're going to take a first look into water, which is one of the ingredients used for making beer. Now, water is often ignored when talking about ingredients in beer, or it's considered less important than those ingredients like malt or hops, but water makes up the majority of beer and can actually have a pretty big impact on the final flavor of the beer. And for the most part, you can get away with using any water that you can drink and doesn't have a bad taste to it. That's almost an oversimplification, but in this first video on water, I just wanted to talk about things generally, since the topic is actually very broad. At first, I'll cover basic water terms and water used for brewing with malt extract rather than all grain brewing. In future videos, I'll go more into depth with how pH and mineral content in beer can have a big effect on flavor and mouthfeel of beer. So let's start with the source water used for brewing. Water usually comes from either surface water, like lakes or rivers, or groundwater from underground aquifers. Surface water usually has high organic matter content and is low in minerals, and usually requires filtration and disinfection to remove dangerous bacteria. Groundwater is low in organic matter, but may be higher in mineral content. It usually requires less filtration and disinfection, but may need to be treated if the water is hard, that is, having high mineral content. When determining if your source water is sufficient for brewing, the first thing you want to do is to taste it. If it tastes clean, you're good to use it. The biggest concern with source water, particularly when it comes from surface water, is chlorine flavor or aroma. Chlorine or chloramine are added to the water treatment facilities to disinfect water before it reaches your home. But these chemicals undergo a reaction with yeast during fermentation to produce a medicinal or a Band-Aid-like flavor. It's also a reason you shouldn't use a regular garden hose to fill your mash tun or kettle. Only use a food-grade hose that is safe for brewing. If you have these chemicals in your water, you need to treat it by boiling the water, using activated carbon filtration, adding metabisulfite tablets, or just using a different water source. Other off flavors from the water include pond-like flavors and aromas or metallic taste, which may come from pipes. There are ways to treat this at home, but it may be easier to go with bottled water instead if you have these. If you get your water from your town or city, you will have access to an annual water report that provides information on mineral content. When brewing extract beers, you'll want low mineral water, which means that all the ion species are less than 5 parts per million, or ppm. The report will have a lot of components to it, mostly related to levels of possible contaminants in water, but should also mention the content of ions which come from dissolved minerals. The important ions for brewing are calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, sodium, chloride, and sulfate. If you're like me and have a well, you'll need to send a sample of water off to be tested, or buy a kit that can determine the mineral content of your water. Turning now to John Palmer, who literally wrote the book on brewing water, as well as the book How to Brew, he offers the following guidelines for brewing water. Number 1, hardness is good. Number 2, alkalinity is bad. Number 3, water pH can be used as a general indicator of the balance between hardness and alkalinity in the water. Number 4, hardness and alkalinity affect the water and mash pH. And number 5, sodium, chloride, and sulfate do not affect pH, but can affect the beer's flavor. It is important to understand some definitions here. Water hardness refers to the amount of calcium and magnesium ions in water, so called because of how the ions can lead to residue buildup. Hardness can be classified as either temporary or permanent. Temporary hardness comes from ions that are dissolved from carbonates and precipitate out when the water is boiled. Permanent hardness comes from ions dissolved from soluble salts like chloride and sulfate and cannot be removed by boiling. Hardness is good because minimum levels of calcium and magnesium are important for yeast health, fermentability of the wort, and beer clarity. When using malt extract, these ions are already present, so it's recommended to use low mineral or distilled water. Too much hardness can make the beer taste minerally. Alkalinity is a measure of dissolved carbonate and bicarbonate ions in the water. Alkalinity raises the pH of wort and beer and is mostly a concern with all grain brewing, but can affect the flavor of extract beer by causing malt flavor to be dull and hop bitterness to be harsh. It's also the reason softened water is not recommended for brewing. The process only removes calcium and magnesium while leaving alkalinity. It's recommended to brew with water that has a total alkalinity of less than 50 ppm as calcium carbonate. pH is a scale used to measure how acidic or alkaline water is. Pure water has a pH of 7 and is neither acidic nor alkaline. Water with a pH less than 7 is acidic, and greater than 7 is alkaline. When it comes to extract brewing, water pH is not that important. We care more about the pH of the wort and the beer, which are affected by the use of different grains as well as the ion concentration of the water salts that are added to it. That will be covered more in depth in another video. Of the ions that are important in the brewing process, calcium, magnesium, and bicarbonate are the ones which constitute water hardness and alkalinity. Malt extract will contain these ions already, so your starting water will want to be low in mineral content. Chloride, sulfate, and sodium affect beer's flavor. Chloride accentuates the maltiness of beer, making it seem fuller and sweeter. Sulfate accentuates the hop character of the beer and makes it seem drier and crisper. Sodium can also accentuate malt, but too high concentrations tend to give a highly mineral character. Brewers will use a ratio of sulfate to chloride to see how the water profile will affect the balance of malt and hops in the beer. Hoppy beer styles will have a higher ratio, often 3:1 or more. Malty beers will have a lower ratio, something like 0.5:1. A ratio of 1:1 is considered balanced. This table shows suggested amounts of each ion in brewing water. If your brewing water has too much of a certain ion, you are better off using distilled water. If you're brewing with malt extract, there will be enough of the ions in there for fermentation. For all grain brewing, you can add brewing salts to build a target water profile, but that's a topic for another video. Two books that I could recommend if you are interested in learning more about water are, as I mentioned, the book written by John Palmer about water, which is called Water, also co-authored by Colin Kaminsky. This is a very definitive deep dive into specifically the kind of water chemistry, and even more so with all grain brewing water. And likewise, How to Brew, also written by John Palmer, has a lot of information in here completely about everything related to brewing, but also goes into detail about water both for extract brewing as well as all grain brewing. All right, that's all there is for this first video on water. Hopefully that was enlightening and made you realize that water is more important than just something that you're dumping in to fill up the content of the beer. So until next time, cheers.